I don't think I'll ever forget the first day I walked into that gym. It was located in a repurposed warehouse with peeling gray paint on the outside and just a single, flickering fluorescent light near the entrance. A bright, cartoonish sign by the main door read, "Jump and Joy," though the letters had faded, giving the place an oddly melancholy feel. Inside, however, it was a whirlwind of sound and color, children laughing, squealing, and running around on enormous padded mats while harried parents tried to keep up. Music played from overhead speakers, providing a cheery soundtrack to the chaos. At 16, this was my first job beyond mowing lawns in my neighborhood. I was thrilled to have a paycheck, but more than that, I was excited to be around the energy of kids' parties. It was supposed to be all fun and games, an easy gig, right? I learned the basic duties quickly. We organized birthday parties, supervised the big inflatable slides, and kept an eye on the kids as they tumbled through mini obstacle courses. We also had a giant swing hung from the ceiling's metal beams, which was a massive hit. My boss showed me how to grip the rope securely and give gentle pushes while making sure no one spun out of control. During those early days, I'd sometimes find myself staring at the high ceiling, noticing how the metal rafters interlocked in geometric patterns. They were painted the same dull gray as the exterior, and rarely did anyone look up there. The action was always down on the mats, on the trampolines, or near the birthday cake table. For the first few weeks, everything was normal, at least as normal as a kids' party venue can be. I'd come in, put on my staff t-shirt, and run through the typical routine, greet the families, explain the safety rules, and help the children onto the equipment. My coworkers were mostly other high school students. One of them, Allison, stood out to me because she was deeply religious. She wore a small silver cross around her neck, but more than that, she carried a quiet, watchful air. She didn't gossip much in the break room, unlike the rest of us who joked around to pass the time between parties. I found her demeanor comforting, as though she was prepared to handle any crisis with calm determination. Then, one Saturday morning, everything changed. I arrived earlier than usual for a special gymnastics class we hosted before the real parties started. The gym was quiet except for soft music and the light thud of kids practicing tumbles. The sun was barely peeking through the high windows, casting pale beams across the mats. I saw Allison talking to one of the little boys who was enrolled in the class. She looked tense. After a moment, she motioned for me to come over. She whispered, "He says he sees a boy up in the rafters." The child seemed anxious, craning his neck to look upward. Naturally, I glanced up too, half expecting to see a maintenance worker or maybe a stray balloon snagged in the beams. But there was nothing, just stretches of gray metal and pipes. "Kids have wild imaginations," I told Allison, trying to sound confident. She nodded, but I noticed a flicker of worry in her eyes. Later that same day, two of my other coworkers hurried into the break room, out of breath and clearly shaken. They'd just supervised a party for a bunch of 5-year-olds, including a set of twins. The twins had gone down the big slide, hopped off at the bottom, and then, without any prompting, both stared up at that very same corner of the ceiling. They insisted there was another boy up there. Their voices were so earnest that it left my coworkers spooked. When Allison heard this story, she merely pressed her lips into a tight line. She looked as though she wanted to say something but held back. I was starting to feel uneasy. Sure, children might mimic each other or share stories, but these incidents happened in different classes with different groups, and each time the kids seemed genuinely perplexed or even frightened. That same afternoon, I decided to check out the rafters for myself. During a lull, I climbed on a stack of foam blocks to get closer to the ceiling. Dust motes sparkled in the fluorescent light, and I could hear the distant chatter of parents in the lobby. The overhead metal beams were thick with grime, but there were no hidden platforms or catwalks, no sign of anything that could be mistaken for a person. The final straw for me that day came during the last birthday party of my shift. I was operating our giant swing for a boy named Jason, who must have been around 5 or 6. At first, he squealed with delight as I pushed him, shouting for me to go higher. But then, in the middle of one long arc, he just went quiet. When the swing slowed enough for me to see his face, he looked pale, almost transfixed. "Hey," he said, squinting at the ceiling, "there's a little boy up there." He pointed toward the same section of beams everyone else had indicated. I followed his gaze, my own heart hammering against my chest. Again, nothing. The overhead lights hummed and the metal rafters stared back blankly. I tried to keep my voice steady. "It's probably just the lights playing tricks," I replied. But I could tell the boy wasn't convinced, and to be honest, neither was I. Something about his unwavering stare sent a chill down my spine. The next day, I came in for my shift, feeling unsettled, but I told myself it was just the power of suggestion. That was until our manager, a usually unflappable woman named Patricia, called us into the break room. She had the live security feed from the gym on screen. We all crowded around, expecting to see maybe some kids who snuck in early or a loose balloon drifting by. What we saw, however, shook us to the core. The giant swing was moving. Not just a slight sway from an air current. No, it was swinging back and forth as if someone invisible were riding it. We could see the ropes strain with each arc. The seats, empty and swaying, looked almost playful. Yet no one was in the gym at that time, and the doors were locked. For a moment, we just watched in stunned silence. That big swing, twisting in the vacant air, had a strange mix of innocence and eeriness. It was easy to imagine a ghostly child gleefully taking his turn when no one else was around. The manager finally stopped the footage, her hands trembling just enough for me to notice. "I can't explain this," she said, her voice hushed, "but we need to keep this under control. Parents can't get wind of anything weird happening here. We'd lose business." We all nodded, though my mind was already whirling with questions. If this was real, and I was starting to believe it was, what did that child want? Why was he always seen in the same corner of the ceiling so close to that swing? Allison said little, just pressed her cross between her fingers. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances. None of us wanted to say the word ghost, but we all thought it. After that meeting, I returned home, nerves on edge and heart thumping like I'd just run a marathon. In my bedroom that night, I couldn't stop replaying the footage in my head. That swing, drifting on its own, seemed so impossible. And yet, I'd seen it with my own eyes. I sensed that the harmless sightings might only be the tip of something much more disturbing. Somehow, I just knew the playful arcs and innocent stares at the ceiling were opening a door to something larger. I had no idea how bad things would get, or how deep the darkness in that old warehouse could go, but I was about to find out in ways I never could have imagined. The morning after we watched that unsettling video, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in my own home. I chalked it up to paranoia, the kind that creeps in after you realize the world might be more mysterious than you once believed. I half expected to see a child's silhouette in my closet or perched on my windowsill. Of course, nothing happened there, but the dread lingered, trailing me like a shadow as I headed back to the gym. When I arrived, Patricia was in her office, frantically typing emails. She paused when she saw me in the doorway. "We're going to keep this under wraps, all right?" she said, her tone firm but laced with worry. "If parents start believing the place is haunted, we'll lose everything." I simply nodded, understanding the business angle, but also feeling uneasy about ignoring the situation. Something strange was happening, whether we talked about it or not. Within an hour, kids started streaming in for a weekend birthday bash. I ran through the usual routine, plastering a smile on my face while I helped them onto the trampolines and guided them through the foam pit. Everything seemed normal at first, but about 20 minutes into the party, a little girl tugged on my hand. She gazed at me with wide eyes and then glanced up at the rafters. "Is there a secret room up there?" she asked innocently. I saw somebody looking down. My stomach did a small somersault. I gently guided her back to the group, murmuring that the ceiling was just for lights and ventilation. Even as I assured her, though, I could feel the prickling of the hairs on the back of my neck. I found Allison by the balance beams, supervising a few older kids. She didn't even wait for me to speak. She must have read the worry on my face. "Another sighting?" she asked quietly. I nodded. She exhaled, glancing at the beams overhead. "I've been preying on this," she said, "but I don't know what we're dealing with yet." She looked at me, eyes full of genuine concern. "It might be a spirit that doesn't realize it's scaring people." "What are we supposed to do?" I whispered. I felt entirely out of my depth, like a child who'd stumbled into a dark forest without a flashlight. Allison paused, then shook her head. "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but I think we need to find out why it's here." The rest of the party passed in a blur of piñata swings, birthday cake slices, and squealing children. Every so often, I'd catch a kid glancing upward, their expressions curious or uneasy. By the time the party ended, I felt emotionally drained. Yet, the day was far from over. 2 more parties were scheduled, and I dreaded the possibility of more sightings. During my second party of the day, I found myself manning the giant swing again. Each child took a turn, shrieking with delight as I pushed them. My heart pounded every time the swing's arc brought them near the rafters. I kept imagining that this phantom boy was hovering there, invisible to me, but crystal clear to the children. Oddly enough, no one said anything during that party. But as soon as it ended, and I went to gather the leftover juice boxes, I felt a distinct chill across my skin, as though someone were standing close behind me. I spun around, expecting to see a coworker or a child who'd gotten separated from the group. No one was there. The faint squeak of the swing ropes swayed overhead, even though I hadn't touched them in minutes. By the time the final party rolled around, the staff was on edge. The other employees, my classmates and friends, cracked jokes to lighten the mood, but I could tell they were nervous. We all felt it, that strange presence making the air heavy. This last party was for a rambunctious group of 6-year-olds, and they came in with confetti cannons and high-pitched laughter. Everything started smoothly enough: cake, dancing, and silly games. But halfway through, one of the dads, who was videotaping, approached me, brow furrowed. "Hey, did you guys see something up there?" He pointed his camcorder at the rafters. My stomach sank. Probably just the lights," I stammered, following the company line. The father didn't look convinced. "Huh," he muttered, glancing back at the screen. It looked like a kid for a second. I forced a laugh, telling him it must have been a trick of the camera. He shrugged and wandered off, but not before giving the ceiling another uncertain glance. Soon after, the entire group gathered for a group photo by the giant swing. The kids clustered in front of it, big grins on their faces, while the parents snapped pictures. As the camera flashes lit up the gym, I was sure I saw movement just above the swing, a fleeting silhouette, there and gone in an instant. My heart lurched, and I felt momentarily lightheaded. Nobody else reacted. If anyone else saw it, they didn't say a word. The session ended, the kids cheered for the photos, and the parents started herding them toward the exit. Finally, the day wound down. Most families left in a flurry of jackets and goodie bags. A handful of staff and I remained to clean up. The gym always looked eerie after closing. Lights dim, decorations half torn, shadows stretching across the mats. Usually I'd feel relief that another busy day was over, but now all I felt was apprehension. We huddled in the break room, exchanging uneasy glances. Patricia checked her phone, murmuring something about the security footage. I noticed Allison was absent, so I quietly slipped out to find her. I discovered her in the equipment closet, sitting on a wooden crate. The overhead bulb flickered, revealing how shaken she looked. "I tried to pray again," she said in a wavering voice, "but there's a heaviness I can't explain. It's like something doesn't want help, or it's trapped and doesn't even know it needs help." A surge of sympathy flooded my chest. "Maybe we should do more than pray," I said. "We could research the building's history, find out if something happened here before it was a kid's gym." Allison nodded slowly, as if that idea had been hovering in her mind. "That might help us figure out who, or what, is up there." Back in the break room, we told Patricia we wanted to dig around for any records about the warehouse. She wasn't thrilled. "Just don't let it interfere with your work," she warned, "and keep it quiet." She had a point. Word getting out about ghostly sightings could ruin the business, but she also didn't try to stop us outright. That night, I returned home exhausted. Even after a hot shower, I couldn't relax. My head was filled with swirling thoughts. The father's camcorder, the fleeting silhouette, the children's whispers about a boy overhead. More than once, I caught myself tilting my head up to examine my own ceiling, half expecting to see a shape there. Each time, I told myself to get a grip. But logic offered little comfort against the insidious notion that an unseen presence had latched onto the gym, and maybe onto us as well. Before finally crawling into bed, I opened my laptop and typed "warehouse accidents," followed by the name of our town. Pages of unrelated news stories popped up, but nothing about our specific address. Still, I vowed I wouldn't give up. If there was a story behind this spirit, if it truly was the ghost of a child, then there had to be a reason for him to hover in the rafters, fixated on that giant swing. My gut churned as I imagined a tragedy from long ago, waiting to be unearthed. But as fatigued as I was, I felt an odd spark of determination. I needed answers, for everyone's sake, and maybe for that lost little boy in the ceiling too. The following week, the strange sightings continued. During a preschool gymnastics class, a teacher pulled me aside, eyes wide. One of the toddlers had run crying from the corner of the gym, saying another kid wouldn't share the swing, even though none of the other children were anywhere near the equipment. Word spread among the staff. It seemed like every day brought a new incident. A child pointing at empty rafters, an unexplained shadow flitting across a wall, or that swing moving on its own when no one was around. By now, the staff was jumpy. Even the cynics who'd initially dismissed the rumors were looking over their shoulders. Patricia, trying to maintain morale, organized a quick staff meeting. She reminded us of our professional duty to keep the parties running smoothly. No one openly disagreed, but I could sense we all felt uneasy pretending everything was normal. Allison, especially, looked conflicted. She clasped her cross as Patricia spoke, eyes downcast, as though silently praying for guidance. After the meeting, Allison and I slipped away to the gym's storage area, where a couple of dusty filing cabinets sat against the wall. We began sifting through old receipts, liability forms, and staff records, hoping to find any clue about the building's history before it became Jump and Joy. We found reference to a previous tenant, a manufacturing company that had stored industrial equipment in the warehouse, but there was nothing about an accident or child. Still, the place had changed hands multiple times, so maybe the real story was buried elsewhere. That evening, I decided to ask around town. I visited the local library, combing through old newspapers on microfilm. It was tedious work. I scanned headlines about factory closures, labor disputes, and even small-time robberies, but nothing that mentioned a lost child or fatal accident in the warehouse. Frustration began to mount. If something tragic had happened, it hadn't made the papers, or was buried in an obscure corner of the archives. The next day at work, tension hung over the staff like a storm cloud. Every corner felt ominous, every flicker of light a potential sign of the supernatural. During a lull, I found myself pacing near the giant swing, scanning the beams for anything unusual. A wave of goosebumps washed over me, and I had the distinct feeling I wasn't alone. Just as I was about to turn away, the swing jerked. It wasn't a subtle sway. It was as if someone had kicked off the ground to start a gentle ride, yet the seat was empty. I forced myself to step closer. The ropes creaked, and the circular seat drifted in small arcs. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling a little silly. "Is anyone here?" The only answer was the echo of my own voice. Yet, an unsettling warmth brushed past me, like a faint exhale of breath. The swing continued its slow dance, and I backed away, heart hammering. That night, Allison and I stayed after hours, with Patricia's reluctant permission, to see if we could catch any more evidence. The gym was eerily silent when stripped of music and laughter. The overhead lights were dimmed to conserve energy, casting long shadows across the floor. We huddled by the security monitor in the break room, sipping stale coffee as we peered at the screens. Each camera angle showed an empty, lifeless space. For a while, we saw nothing. Then, just as midnight approached, we noticed a flicker on the camera facing the giant swing. At first, it was just a faint distortion, like static. I leaned in, straining my eyes. Then the swing moved. It shifted forward, slowly at first, then gained momentum as though guided by invisible hands. My heart slammed in my chest. Allison gasped softly, her hand flying to her cross. We watched, transfixed, as the seat rose and fell in a steady rhythm. There was no logical explanation. The air conditioners were off, and there were no open windows or fans. The place was sealed for the night. We hurried out to the gym floor, determined to see it with our own eyes. Sure enough, the swing glided through the darkness. The ropes groaned, echoing in the cavernous space. My legs felt like they were wading through thick mud, but I forced myself to approach. As we drew closer, the swing began to slow until it gently came to a stop. The silence that followed was suffocating. Allison placed a hand on the seat. It was warm, as if someone had been sitting there just moments ago. My mouth felt dry. I glanced up at the rafters. Was he there, the elusive boy, silently watching us? The gym felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Allison closed her eyes and muttered a soft prayer. At that instant, a metallic clank echoed from high above. We both jerked our heads upward, shining our flashlights. Nothing but the drab steel beams, a nest of shadows. Yet I couldn't shake the certainty that something had rushed through those rafters, too swift for us to catch. Back in the break room, we replayed the footage. It was even more disturbing on second viewing, like witnessing a ghostly performance. At one point in the video, the swing almost seemed to pause mid-arc, like someone shifting their weight. "He's playing," Allison whispered, voice trembling. "It's like a child sneaking out to have fun after bedtime." My chest tightened with conflicting emotions, fear, fascination, and a strange pang of pity. If it really was a child's spirit, how lonely must he be? We decided then and there to expand our search. If there was no formal record of an accident, maybe we had to look into personal accounts, local folklore, rumors, or even the memories of older residents. It was a long shot, but we had nowhere else to turn. We also agreed not to tell the rest of the staff. Most of them were already on edge, and Patricia would have a meltdown if she suspected we were still chasing ghost stories. Over the next few days, Allison made discreet inquiries at her church, asking if anyone knew of a boy who had passed away near the old industrial district. I quietly asked my parents if they remembered anything tragic about the area. I got nothing more than vague recollections of the warehouse being shuttered for a while. Meanwhile, the sightings continued. Children pointed upward. Parents reported glimpses on their phone cameras, though they usually dismissed it as a trick of the light. One afternoon, as I handed out party favors to a group of giggling toddlers, a small girl looked up at me with serious eyes. "Did you see him?" she asked. My throat tightened. "See who?" I managed to say. She pointed to the ceiling corner. "The boy. He looks sad." Her voice was so matter-of-fact, and it rattled me. I realized then that maybe the spirit wasn't always playful. Maybe there was sorrow woven into his presence, a tragedy that lingered. And I wondered how long he'd been waiting for someone, anyone, to notice and care. By the end of that day, my mind churned with unanswered questions. Who was this child? How did he get trapped in our world of trampolines and birthday banners? And most pressing of all, was he truly just a lonely soul, searching for a playmate, or was there something darker behind that gaze the children always described? The tension in my gut told me that the more we uncovered, the more dangerous this might become. Yet, despite the fear, I was determined. If we didn't help him, or at least understand him, who would? I soon realized that answering those questions would require more than just casual research. I resolved to spend my next day off doing a deep dive into local history. Allison agreed to come along. We started at the public library again, this time requesting city records. The librarian, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Tuttle, led us to a cramped back room filled with file cabinets. "Some of these documents are from building inspections and property transfers," she explained. "You might find something about your warehouse in here." For hours, we combed through stacks of manila folders, many containing mundane details, lists of repairs, electrical permits, insurance forms. My eyes blurred with all the bureaucratic jargon. Allison, more patient than I was, meticulously flipped page after page, occasionally pausing to murmur a prayer for guidance. Eventually, I stumbled upon a yellowed file dating back decades. According to the documents, the warehouse had been part of an old manufacturing complex before being partitioned. Then, a single typed sentence jumped out at me. "Permit requested for installation of child safety railing near mezzanine." It was dated nearly 40 years ago. "What's this?" I said, showing Allison. She frowned. "A child safety railing? In an industrial building?" We dug deeper, but the file ended abruptly. No explanation as to why they needed such a railing, or whether it was ever installed. Still, it was a tiny thread, and I clung to it. If children were present in a factory, maybe there was more to the story. We asked Mrs. Tuttle if there were any newspaper archives that might mention a child in the building during that time frame. She guided us to more reels of microfilm. After another hour of tedious searching, Allison gasped softly. She'd found a small obituary notice from around the same period. It read, "In memory of Daniel Norton, aged 6, who tragically passed away this past Tuesday. Beloved son, gone too soon." The obituary didn't mention the cause of death, nor a location, but it was the first real lead we had, a child who died around the time the warehouse was making modifications for child safety. I jotted the name down, Daniel Norton. It felt like progress, but there was no smoking gun connecting him to our warehouse. Nevertheless, we both felt a sense of foreboding. Were we on the right track, or was this just a coincidence? We decided to keep digging. We scoured city records for any mention of the Norton family. Ultimately, we found a reference to a Norton who'd worked at the manufacturing plant. Our pulses quickened. Perhaps Daniel Norton had been the worker's son wandering into the building. The idea was heartbreaking. Could this be the boy haunting the gym? That evening, we left the library with more questions than answers. On our drive back, Allison gripped the wheel tightly. "If that's him," she said, "maybe he was drawn to the swing because it was something he never got to experience in life. Or maybe it's just a manifestation of how he died." I shuddered at the thought. Dying so young, in a place full of machinery and high catwalks, it was horrifying, and it made me wonder if his spirit was still searching for a moment of joy that he'd missed. When we arrived at the gym the next day, Patricia told us about yet another eerie incident. During a birthday party, the overhead lights had dimmed suddenly, and one child claimed a hand had brushed against her arm. "No one was near her, apparently," Patricia said, rubbing her temples in exasperation. She then sighed. "I've got parents complaining that the place feels off. We can't afford that kind of reputation." She looked at me, then Allison. "If you two find anything, let me know." That same morning, I approached the giant swing apprehensively. Part of me wanted to talk to the spirit, if indeed it was Daniel Norton. I made sure the gym was relatively empty, a rare gap between parties, and then stood before the swing. The ropes were still, the seat resting on the foam mat. My heart thumped in my ears. "Daniel," I whispered, feeling silly and yet strangely compelled. "If you're here, I'm sorry for what happened to you." My voice wavered. I wasn't expecting a response, but the overhead lights flickered, just for a second. It could have been a faulty bulb, or it could have been something else. I was about to turn away when I heard a faint scraping sound from above. Slowly, I lifted my gaze to the rafters. A chill spiked through me as I caught the slightest movement, a shifting shadow near a support beam. Then it was gone. My pulse pounded and my hands began to tremble. I felt both terrified and oddly compelled to stay. Yet I knew I had a job to do, and parents would be arriving soon. Swallowing my fear, I left the gym floor. The image of that flicker in the rafters burned into my mind. Allison, meanwhile, had decided to reach out to her church community. She shared that we might have identified the spirit as Daniel Norton, though she kept the details vague to avoid gossip. A woman in her prayer circle mentioned she had once known a Norton family who suffered a tragic loss decades ago, but she couldn't remember details. Still, it was another thread, suggesting we were on the right path. As the days wore on, the hauntings seemed to intensify. Lights flickered more often. The air grew colder near the swing, sometimes chilling enough to see your breath. Children talked openly about the boy in the rafters, no longer frightened, but oddly accepting. One child even tried to toss a small stuffed animal up toward the beams, insisting he wanted to share his toy with a ceiling friend. It landed with a soft thud on the mat, but the gesture was strangely touching and unsettling. Patricia began to panic more openly. "If this doesn't stop soon," she told us one afternoon, "we might have to shut down for a while. I can't keep explaining these incidents away." She rubbed her forehead. "I'm going to lose this place." Her distress was palpable. As much as the ghostly presence unnerved me, I also felt a pang of compassion for Patricia. She'd poured her savings into transforming the old warehouse into a cheerful business. Now that dream was threatened by something none of us could fully understand. Late one night, while scrolling through online forums about local history, I stumbled onto a small community group. One thread discussed unexplained events in older buildings around town. Most were typical ghost stories, lights turning on by themselves, strange noises, or apparitions. But then one post mentioned a child who died in an industrial accident in the 1980s, a boy named Danny. I nearly dropped my phone. The user claimed the father worked at a factory, and the boy had fallen from an upper platform onto machinery below. The location wasn't specified, but the timeline matched our leads. My hands trembled with excitement and dread as I read on. The father apparently left town soon after the funeral, unable to bear the grief. That felt like the final puzzle piece sliding into place. If Daniel had died falling from a height, it made sense he would linger near the ceiling, as if trapped in that moment or searching for an escape. Perhaps the swing represented flight, freedom from the fall he never survived. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of that sadness. The building might have changed, but the echoes of his last moments could still be tethering him here. Allison and I vowed to confirm the details of this tragedy, to see if we could bring closure for Daniel, and, selfishly, for ourselves and the staff. We hoped that acknowledging his story might help his spirit move on. But deep down, I worried that the boy had grown accustomed to his haunting existence. If he'd been there for decades, was it even possible he'd let go without a fight? The question gnawed at me, and the more I thought about it, the more I sensed that Daniel's attachment was far stronger than a casual curiosity. He had claimed the gym as his realm, and he was nowhere close to leaving on his own. With each passing day, the atmosphere in the gym grew more charged, as though the air itself crackled with unseen energy. Children continued to mention the boy up there, their tones matter-of-fact rather than fearful. It was the parents and staff who looked increasingly unnerved. Patricia began fielding calls from parents who'd heard strange rumors about the place. She tried to brush them off, attributing any odd experiences to imaginative kids, but I could see the stress wearing her down. One afternoon, Allison approached me between parties. Her eyes were ringed with exhaustion, as if she hadn't slept. "I talked to a church elder," she said quietly. "He told me that sometimes spirits linger because they're stuck in trauma. If Daniel died suddenly, he might not even realize he's dead. And if he does, the pain or anger could keep him here." She paused, pressing her cross. "We might need more than just an apology or a prayer. We might need to help him accept what happened." I swallowed hard, recalling the forum post about Daniel's fall. The image of a young boy plummeting from a height made my stomach churn. "I'm willing to try," I said, "but how do we even begin? It's not like we can just ask him to leave." Allison nodded. "I've been reading about blessings, cleansing rituals, things that can help spirits find peace. But we'll need the manager's approval, or we risk losing our jobs." I sighed, knowing Patricia would balk at anything that sounded too superstitious, especially if it risked fueling the haunted rumors. But we had to try. We waited until the next staff meeting to broach the subject. Patricia looked skeptical, but her desperation was evident. "Fine," she finally relented, "but do it after hours. And if it doesn't work, I don't want any of the customers finding out." She glanced around the room, voice dropping. "We can't afford that kind of publicity." That very night, after locking up, a small group of us stayed behind. Me, Allison, a coworker named Jessie, who'd seen the swing move on her own shift, and Patricia herself, albeit reluctantly. We turned off most of the lights, leaving a few lamps and flashlights to guide us. The gym took on a cavernous quality in the dimness, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. We convened near the giant swing, which sat still and silent on the foam mat. Allison handed each of us a small white candle. She explained she'd read about a ritual where light symbolizes guidance for lost spirits. The idea was to invite Daniel to move on, rather than forcibly cast him out. "I don't want to anger him," she whispered. "He's just a child, and I believe he deserves compassion." We stood in a loose circle around the swing, each holding a lit candle. Patricia looked visibly uneasy, as though expecting at any moment for a wraith to descend from the rafters. Allison began with a simple prayer, asking for peace for any spirit who might be trapped. Her voice was steady, echoing slightly in the vast space. I glanced upward, half expecting to see a form peering down at us. Instead, I saw only steel beams and darkness. At first, nothing happened. The candles flickered in the still air, and our small circle stood in tense silence. Then I felt it, an unmistakable drop in temperature. A chill snaked its way around my ankles, traveling up my spine. Patricia sucked in a breath, and Jesse's candle flame wavered as if caught in a sudden draft. Allison's voice trembled. "Daniel," she called softly. "We know you're here. We're here to help." The temperature kept dropping. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a faint mist swirling around the base of the swing. At first, I thought it was dust, but it looked more like a thin layer of fog creeping outward. Jesse gasped, stepping back. Patricia fumbled with her flashlight. I forced myself to stay still, heart hammering. Allison continued speaking. "Daniel, you've been here a long time, haven't you? Maybe you're afraid to leave. But there's love waiting for you beyond this place. You don't have to stay here alone." A sudden, sharp clang reverberated from above. My head snapped up, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I glimpsed a small shadow dart across the rafters. The hair on my arms stood up. Patricia looked ready to bolt, but Allison kept going, her voice stronger now. She closed her eyes, reciting a blessing she'd memorized. As she spoke, my candle flame stretched higher, flickering wildly. The fog around the swing churned as though disturbed by a breeze, though the air was dead still. Then, without warning, the gym lights, those we'd left on, flared to full brightness, flickered, and blew out in a shower of sparks. The entire space plunged into near darkness, illuminated only by our candles and the emergency exit lights. Jessie cried out, and Patricia cursed under her breath. I nearly dropped my candle, my heart thudding in terror. It felt like we'd crossed a line, as though Daniel, or whatever force was present, was resisting. Allison's voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "Daniel, we're sorry for what happened to you. We don't want to hurt you. We just want you to find peace." Her words echoed in the darkness. A slow creaking sound came from the swing, and I saw it begin to sway. Just a little, back and forth, as though someone had taken a seat. Patricia's face was ghostly white in the candlelight, and Jessie pressed herself against the wall. I found myself whispering, "It's okay, Daniel. You're safe." I had no idea if he could hear me, but it felt like the right thing to say. The swing rocked more noticeably. The ropes groaned under a sudden weight. My chest tightened, a mixture of sympathy and fear swirling together. Part of me wanted to run, but another part was desperate to see this through. Gradually, the swing slowed to a stop, and the cold presence in the air seemed to recede, as though drifting away. The candles stopped flickering, and the swirl of fog dissipated. For a moment, it felt like we'd succeeded, that maybe Daniel had found a measure of peace. But then, from high above, came a low, vibrating hum that rattled the metal rafters. It wasn't a child's sound at all, more like a groan of shifting steel. The gym floor trembled ever so slightly beneath our feet, as if the building itself was exhaling a sigh of warning. Allison's face fell. "No," she whispered. "Something's still here. Something's not done." Patricia flicked on her flashlight, her hands shaking. "We have to leave," she said. "I can't stay in this darkness any longer." We exchanged uneasy glances, and Allison snuffed out her candle. Jessie did the same, her face contorted in fear. We retreated to the break room, hearts pounding. Patricia was beyond shaken, muttering that she'd call an electrician about the lights. Allison looked crestfallen, as though her best efforts had been thrown back at her. I felt a hollow sensation in my chest, like we'd poked a sleeping beast and it had stirred, not as a harmless child spirit, but as something more complex and possibly more dangerous. Before we parted ways, I caught Allison by the arm. "Do you think Daniel is angry at us?" I asked quietly. She shrugged, looking lost. "I don't know, but I sense there's a reason he's still here, and it's not just confusion. There's pain, and maybe even rage. We have to figure out how to address that, or this will never end." As I drove home through the empty streets, I wrestled with guilt and dread. Perhaps we'd only half understood Daniel's story. A child might be innocent, but the circumstances of his death, violent, unexpected, could have twisted his spirit. And if we couldn't calm that anger, I feared we might be inviting something far worse than fleeting apparitions and a swinging seat. The gym was no longer just a place of cheerful festivities. It had become a battleground between the living and the unresolved dead, and part of me suspected the worst was yet to come. In the days following our failed cleansing attempt, the atmosphere at Jump and Joy grew almost suffocating. Electrical issues cropped up everywhere, lights flickering, speakers emitting bursts of static that startled kids and adults alike. The employees walked on eggshells. Even the children's laughter sounded brittle, like they sensed the tension beneath the colorful facade. Patricia, frazzled beyond belief, started snapping at minor inconveniences. She even threatened to cut back shifts, worried the drop in parties would cause a financial crisis. Meanwhile, the sightings became more unsettling. One mother claimed she saw a face peering down from the rafters, pale, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Another insisted she heard a child's sobbing echo through the overhead beams. When staff members checked, they found no one, but the stories persisted. Parents exchanged worried looks, and negative online reviews began popping up, mentioning an uneasy vibe and strange occurrences. It was exactly what Patricia had feared. Allison and I felt the weight of responsibility pressing on us. We'd stirred something during that after-hours ritual, and it hadn't gone quietly. One evening, after closing, we stayed late to talk privately. The gym's lights were still malfunctioning, leaving half the floor in shadow. We stood by the unused snack bar, whispering like conspirators. "Maybe we need professional help," I suggested, voice low, like a medium or someone who deals with hauntings for real. Allison hesitated, clearly torn. She was devout and believed in prayer and blessings, but this situation had escalated beyond our understanding. "I know a pastor who specializes in spiritual warfare," she said haltingly, "but if we bring him here, we might scare Patricia more than the ghost." I nodded, acknowledging the dilemma. Still, my instincts screamed that we were out of our depth. The danger felt real, not just for the children who glimpsed a sad boy on the ceiling, but for everyone in the building. We decided to approach Patricia carefully. We found her in her office, shoulders hunched over a stack of overdue bills. Dark circles rimmed her eyes. When we broached the idea of bringing in outside help, she looked at us like we were crazy. "You want me to hire a ghost hunter?" she snapped. "We're already losing money, and you think I can just risk the rumor mill going wild?" Allison sighed. "Patricia, people are talking anyway. It's better we try to fix this than keep it quiet until something worse happens." Her words hung in the air. Eventually, Patricia relented, though reluctantly. "Fine, but keep it discreet. If word gets out that we're investigating a haunting, I'll never recover my reputation." We made contact with a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Lena, who agreed to come in after hours the following night. She sounded professional on the phone, explaining her process involved infrared cameras and electronic voice recorders. "I don't perform exorcisms," she clarified, "but I can document activity and possibly communicate with the entity." I wasn't sure how I felt about ghost hunting gadgets, but at this point, we were grasping at straws. When Lena arrived, she set up her equipment methodically, placing devices on tripods around the gym. Allison and I explained the sightings, the children's testimonies, and the swinging seat. Lena listened intently, occasionally nodding. "A child's spirit often starts out benign," she said, "but if the death was traumatic, the energy can become volatile, especially if the spirit feels misunderstood or threatened." My stomach twisted at the memory of our attempted cleansing and how the building seemed to quake afterward. Around midnight, we gathered in the gym under the dim emergency lights. Lena turned on an EVP recorder, a small device meant to capture electronic voice phenomena. She asked basic questions, pausing for responses we couldn't hear with our own ears. "Is there someone here with us?" Pause. "Can you tell us your name?" Pause. In that silence, the entire gym felt like it was holding its breath. Suddenly, the giant swing jerked. Not a gentle sway, but a sharp tug that set it oscillating. Lena's eyes lit up. She pointed her camera at the swing, and Allison grabbed my arm. My heartbeat thundered. Lena calmly continued her questions. "Are you trying to show us you're here? Do you want to communicate?" The swing rocked harder, as though an unseen child was furiously pumping his legs. The ropes groaned, and the seat scraped against the mat. Then came a low moaning sound from the rafters, a metallic whine that made my skin crawl. Lena lifted her camera toward the ceiling, her flashlight illuminating the crisscrossing beams. I peered up, half expecting to see a pale, mournful face staring down. Nothing visible moved, but the sense of presence was overpowering, like a thick fog, pressing in on all sides. After several tense moments, the swing slowed. Lena checked her devices, a small crease forming between her eyebrows. "I'm picking up some unusual energy levels," she said. She played back a snippet of the recording. At first, all we heard was static. Then faintly, there was a whisper, so quiet it was barely discernible. We replayed it multiple times, and while it was hard to make out distinct words, it sounded like a child's voice. My chest tightened. Could it be Daniel? Was he trying to speak? The moment I had that thought, every light in the gym, emergency bulbs included, winked out. We were plunged into pitch blackness, and I heard Allison gasp. Lena fumbled for her flashlight, and my heart thrashed in my chest like a caged animal. The darkness felt alive, wrapping around us. From above came a soft, scuttling noise, like something sliding across metal. My mind conjured an image of a small figure crawling through the rafters, searching for a vantage point to watch us. "Everyone stay calm," Lena ordered, her voice steady despite the circumstances. She flicked on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the ceiling. The scuttling stopped. The swing was still now, barely moving in the gloom. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I realized my hands were shaking. After a few long, tense minutes, the lights flickered back on, dimmer than before but functional. Lena looked at her equipment again, brows drawn. "That took a lot of energy," she murmured. "This spirit is powerful. Fear and attention can feed it, especially if it's fueled by trauma. It's not evil in the traditional sense, but it's definitely distressed." Distressed. The word echoed in my mind. We were dealing with the sorrow and confusion of a child who had died violently, possibly feeling abandoned or lost. How could we quell that kind of anguish? Allison seemed to have the same thought. She stepped forward, voice trembling slightly. "Daniel, if you can hear me, we don't want to hurt you. We just want you to be at peace." Silence was her only answer, and the overhead beams loomed menacingly. Eventually, we called it a night. Lena promised to review her footage and audio for any clues. "I'll reach out with what I find," she said, packing up her gear. "But in the meantime, try not to antagonize whatever's here. Fear can escalate activity." She gave us a sympathetic look before leaving. Walking out of the gym, I felt drained, like I'd run a marathon with no finish line. Allison was quiet beside me, clutching her cross so tightly her knuckles turned white. We both knew that knowledge alone wouldn't necessarily free Daniel, or us, from this haunting. Something deeper was required, some act of understanding or compassion that might let him finally rest. As I unlocked my car, I glanced back at the hulking warehouse. Its windows were dark, the sign, "Jump and Joy," faintly illuminated by a lone street lamp. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in one of the high windows, like a small shape peering out. My stomach lurched. I blinked, and the shape was gone. If Daniel was truly trapped there, how lonely must he feel, watching us leave night after night? I felt a pang of guilt for abandoning him to that echoing space. But what could I do, short of living in a haunted gym? I started the engine, the radio crackling with static. As I pulled away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting the building to flicker or shift. It stood silently in the distance. Yet, a shiver ran down my spine, because I knew we hadn't solved anything. We'd merely peeled back another layer of a mystery that was rapidly growing darker and more dangerous. And part of me feared that if we couldn't find a way to help him soon, Daniel might not remain a sorrowful child for long. He could become something far more frightening, shaped by decades of anger and loneliness. Days turned into a strange routine of denial and dread. By day, we tried to keep the gym functioning, hosting parties and classes as though everything was normal. By night, we braced for more disturbances. Lena sent us updates indicating she had captured odd voices and shapes on her recordings, but she couldn't decipher much beyond the sense of a child's presence. Meanwhile, reviews trickled in online about flickering lights and odd cold spots. Patricia was desperate to hang on, offering discounts and free trial classes. Still, the tension was evident. Allison dove deeper into her faith, speaking with her pastor and reading every passage she could find on restless spirits. She believed that while Daniel was the core presence, something else might have latched onto his anguish, a darker energy feeding off his sorrow and the fear it caused. The idea terrified me. It suggested we weren't just dealing with a lonely ghost, but also with a parasitic force, twisting that sadness into something malevolent. One afternoon, in a rare moment of downtime, I chatted with a boy named Milo who was waiting for his mom to finish talking to Patricia about scheduling. Milo was about 7, wearing bright red sneakers that squeaked against the mat. He kept staring upward, so I asked if he was looking for something. He shrugged. "Just that boy," he said casually. "He looks sad." My heart quickened. "Have you talked to him?" I ventured. Milo shook his head. "He doesn't talk, he just watches." Then Milo's mom called him, and he trotted away, leaving me with a fluttering pulse. Even without words, Daniel was forming connections with the children. That evening, Allison and I decided we needed a direct approach. We made a plan to stay overnight, not just for a couple hours, but until morning. Patricia wouldn't agree easily, but after we explained that we wanted to observe the gym in its quietest hours, hoping to communicate with Daniel or at least record more evidence, she reluctantly conceded. "If this helps you figure out how to stop whatever's going on, fine," she said, looking utterly exhausted. "Just don't damage anything or call the press." So, we packed some blankets, water, and snacks, intending to brave the gym's darkness. It felt surreal, like a kid planning a secret sleepover, except we weren't dealing with pillow forts and flashlight tag. Instead, we had potential poltergeist activity. My heart hammered as we locked the main doors and watched the last staff member depart, leaving just me, Allison, and the silent, cavernous space. It was around 10 p.m. when we began our vigil. For the first hour, nothing happened. We sat on folded mats near the giant swing, keeping our voices low. A few times, we heard distant clangs from the old heating system, but that was normal for the aging warehouse. Around midnight, we decided to do a slow walkthrough, scanning every nook and cranny with flashlights. The fluorescent lights were off, and our footsteps echoed eerily. The place felt more massive than ever, the corners receding into inky darkness. At one point, near the foam pit, I thought I heard a faint giggle, so soft I wondered if I'd imagined it. I motioned to Allison, and we both hushed our breaths. The giggle came again, distant and fleeting. We followed it, shining our beams toward the rafters. Nobody was there. A soft scuttling noise overhead made my skin prickle. We both called Daniel's name, but no response came, just that thick silence. Back near the swing, we laid out our sleeping bags, though I doubted we'd get much rest. Allison began humming a hymn under her breath, her expression pensive. I tried to keep my mind off my fear, sipping from my water bottle and forcing small talk. "Think Patricia will ever forgive us if we can't fix this?" I asked jokingly, though worry laced my words. Allison attempted a smile. "I don't even care if she forgives me. I just want Daniel to be okay." The hours dragged on. Around 2 a.m., we both dozed off for a bit, the gym floor cold and unwelcoming. I woke to a scraping sound, my eyes snapping open. The giant swing was in motion, only this time it glided slowly, almost lazily, as if someone was gently rocking. I nudged Allison awake. She sat up, heart pounding. We watched in silence, the beam of our flashlight dancing on the swing. "Daniel," Allison whispered, her voice thick with sleep and fear. The swing rocked again, softly. Then, from behind us, came a child's sob, a fragile, heartbreaking sound. I spun around, shining my light in every direction. Nothing. Yet my chest constricted with empathy for that disembodied cry. Was Daniel in pain? Did he realize he was dead and stuck here? Allison crossed herself, tears brimming in her eyes. "We want to help you," she called into the darkness. "Show us what you need." The air felt electric, humming with emotion. The sobbing ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence. The swing slowed to a standstill. A sudden thought struck me. Maybe he was scared of us, just as we were scared of him. Before we could say another word, the overhead speaker system crackled to life. A burst of static blasted through the gym, making us jump. Then faintly, we heard a voice, garbled, childlike. My blood ran cold. Allison fumbled for her phone, trying to record the audio. We both inched toward the source of the sound, near the reception desk. The speakers hissed and popped, but I swore I caught a single word: stop. The distortion was thick, but it was enough to make my legs weak. Was he telling us to stop searching, or was it a plea to stop the pain he felt? Then the speakers went dead. Our labored breathing filled the void. Allison stared at me, her eyes shining with tears. He spoke, she whispered, a tremor in her voice. He actually spoke. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and despair. Relief, because it meant we might communicate more clearly. Despair, because that one word dripped with agony. We decided to stay up the rest of the night, but nothing else happened quite as dramatic. A few distant thuds echoed overhead, and occasionally we felt a cold breeze on the back of our necks, but no more voices emerged. By sunrise, we were exhausted, physically and emotionally. We opened the shutters to let in the weak morning light, the gym's bright party colors, a stark contrast to the eerie events of the night. As we prepared to leave, we gathered our belongings in heavy silence. Allison's hands shook when she tried to put away her flashlight. "We need a new strategy," she finally said, her voice raw. "This isn't just about letting Daniel know we see him. We have to find what's binding him here." She stared at the giant swing. "If he's truly asking us to stop, maybe we're going about this the wrong way. Maybe he needs to face his pain before he can move on, and we're accidentally making it worse." I recalled Lena's words about a darker energy feeding off sorrow and fear. If Daniel was sad or angry, perhaps that malevolence was amplifying his distress. I felt a pang of guilt. We'd tried everything we could think of: prayers, gentle invitations, and even a paranormal investigator. Yet Daniel still sobbed in the darkness, his voice crackling through the speakers in a single word that might as well have been a scream. Walking out into the bright morning felt disorienting, as though we were leaving another world behind us. Yet I knew the haunting followed us, etched into our minds. The vibrant graffiti on the walls and the sunshine couldn't mask the shadows we glimpsed inside. As I drove away, the rising sun painted the horizon in soft pinks and oranges. I thought about Daniel, stuck in perpetual night, swinging alone in that vast, echoing gym. A determination solidified in my chest. I wouldn't give up on him, because if we didn't help him soon, I feared something else would tighten its grip on his spirit and unleash a nightmare no one was prepared to face. By the following week, the situation reached a breaking point. Parties were getting canceled. Some staff members quit, spooked by rumors or simply unable to handle the tension. Patricia was beside herself, pacing her office with phone in hand, trying to salvage bookings. The once lively gym felt like a ghost town, pun intended. A few loyal families still came, but the energy was hollow, as if everyone sensed an underlying gloom. Allison and I grew increasingly anxious. Our attempts to reason with Daniel's spirit or comfort him had led to fleeting contacts, whispers, sobs, the word stop. Lena's evidence confirmed a supernatural presence, but it hadn't provided a roadmap to fixing the problem. Adding to our stress, the building itself started exhibiting strange physical phenomena: cracks in the walls that Patricia insisted hadn't been there before, sudden drops in temperature that rattled the ancient HVAC system, and odd shifts in the floor as though something pushed from underneath. Maintenance personnel found no logical explanation, leaving us to suspect the intensifying haunt. One evening, Allison suggested we track down Daniel Norton's father, if he was still alive, and see if he could help. The notion felt grim, but we were out of options. Perhaps hearing from his father, or receiving some closure from that side of his life, would free Daniel from the endless loop of his tragedy. We started making calls to local directories, searching for any Nortons who might have ties to the area. Most led nowhere, or to distant relatives who'd never heard of Daniel. Finally, through a combination of online sleuthing and local leads, we found a man named Robert Norton. living in a neighboring county. His age lined up with what we knew of Daniel's father. Calling him was nerve-wracking. Allison volunteered, her voice wavering as she explained she was looking into a historical matter regarding the old manufacturing plant. At the mention of his son's name, Robert Norton fell silent. Then he quietly said, "Why are you asking?" The gravity in his tone made my stomach twist, even though I wasn't the one on the line. Allison gently explained we believed Daniel's spirit lingered in the building. She expected disbelief or anger, but Robert simply released a shuddering sigh. "I always feared he wouldn't rest," he murmured, grief lacing his words, despite the decades that had passed. He hesitated, then agreed to meet us, though he warned he had no idea how to help. "I've been haunted by Daniel's death my entire life," he said, voice breaking. A few days later, Robert arrived at the gym in the late afternoon, wearing a worn jacket and carrying a small wooden box. He was in his 60s, hair silvered, posture stooped by a lifetime of guilt and sorrow. His eyes flitted nervously across the bright murals in the giant swing. "So this is it," he said softly, as though seeing ghosts of machinery instead of foam mats and trampolines. Patricia had allowed us to meet him before opening, as long as we locked the doors and kept it quick. We led him to the corner under the rafters, where the sightings were most frequent. His hand trembled as he touched the cold metal beam. "He fell," Robert whispered, "from up there, where there used to be a catwalk." He inhaled shakily. "I was the foreman. I brought him to work one day, no babysitter, and I thought I could keep an eye on him, just for a few hours." His voice cracked. He was so curious, climbing around. I turned my back for a second, and then... He couldn't finish. Allison placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. His eyes brimmed with tears, and I felt my own chest tighten. Hearing the story firsthand was almost unbearable, imagining a playful 6-year-old exploring a dangerous environment, one misstep away from tragedy. Robert opened the wooden box, revealing a small stuffed bear, threadbare but well kept. "This was Daniel's," he said, voice hollow. "He called it Mr. Buttons." My throat closed up. The idea that Daniel's only earthly keepsake might help us reach him felt both hopeful and heartbreaking. We decided to conduct a small private ceremony right then. Robert agreed, though he was still uncertain. He just wanted to do something, anything, to release decades of regret. We stood in a tight circle near the giant swing. Allison lit a single candle and asked Robert to speak directly to Daniel, to tell him anything he needed to say. Robert took a shaking breath, holding the small bear close. "Daniel," he began, tears streaking down his cheeks. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to get hurt. I miss you every day." His voice quivered. "Please, son, if you're here, know that I love you." The candle flame flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows across Robert's anguished face. We heard a distant groan from the rafters, like metal bending under pressure. With trembling hands, Robert set the stuffed bear on the swing's seat. "This was yours," he whispered. "I kept it all these years, hoping you'd somehow know I never forgot." Allison, eyes wet, softly prayed for Daniel's spirit to find rest, to let go of the pain. I stood by, my heart hammering. The air around us grew heavy, and a sudden coldness swept over the swing. Then, to our astonishment, the bear shifted ever so slightly, as though tugged by an unseen hand. Robert gasped, stepping back. A faint sob echoed through the gym, one we heard not just with our ears, but in our chests, vibrating with raw emotion. The swing began to move, gently, carrying the bear in a slow arc. My entire body trembled. "Daniel, it's okay," Allison said in a soothing tone. "Your dad is here. He wants you to come home." The seat rocked softly, as if a child were sitting beside the plush toy, comforting himself with its presence. Robert was openly weeping now, repeating, "I'm sorry," like a mantra. A sudden flicker of lights made us all jump. The overhead lamps dimmed, then brightened, as though some internal battle raged within the building's electrical system. Then, as quickly as it began, the disturbance ended. The gym fell silent, except for Robert's quiet sobs. The candle flame stabilized. I felt a current of air pass by me, like a soft exhalation of relief. The swing slowed, gently coming to rest. The stuffed bear remained upright, defying gravity for a moment before sliding to the edge of the seat, as though carefully placed down. Robert's eyes shone. "Daniel?" he choked out. For a heartbeat, the only answer was stillness. Then the overhead speakers crackled. We all stiffened, anticipating another garbled command to stop. But instead, there was a gentle static, followed by a barely audible whisper. I couldn't make out words, but it sounded like a child's faint murmur, almost content. Tears spilled down Allison's cheeks. Afterward, the heaviness in the air seemed to lift a little. Robert picked up the bear with reverence, as though he half expected Daniel's spirit to remain attached to it. Patricia, who'd been anxiously watching from a distance, crept forward, eyes wide. "Did it work?" she breathed. None of us answered immediately, uncertain. We had certainly made contact, forging a moment of reconnection between father and son. Whether that would be enough to free Daniel entirely, we couldn't know. Robert left the gym with his shoulders slightly straighter, a spark in his tired eyes. He said he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in decades. Still, we weren't naive enough to believe everything was resolved. Daniel's tragedy had lingered for years, and a single emotional moment might not unravel that much pain overnight. Yet, hope flickered in my chest. If Daniel had reached out through the swing and the speakers, if he'd responded to his father's apology, maybe he was on the path to acceptance. That evening, though, as Allison and I prepared to lock up, we noticed the lights flickering again. The swinging seat was still, and the stuffed bear was gone. Robert had taken it. But the sense of tension persisted, as if the building remembered, or perhaps something else did. The darker presence that Lena had mentioned still loomed, a hungry shadow waiting for Daniel's sorrow to resurface. And I realized, with a sinking heart, that this might only be the beginning of a final showdown, one that would either set Daniel free or drag us all deeper into the darkness. For a few days following Robert's visit, the gym felt calmer, almost as if a cloud had been lifted. The lights stabilized, and fewer kids reported seeing the mysterious boy overhead. Allison and I allowed ourselves a cautious optimism. Maybe Daniel's spirit had finally found a measure of peace. Perhaps father and son's emotional reunion had released some of the pent-up grief that fueled the haunting. But by the end of the week, subtle signs of trouble crept back in. A staff member heard the swing squeaking in the empty gym and felt an oppressive cold near the foam pit. Another said they smelled something foul, like burnt plastic, wafting through the air without explanation. Parents continued to call in cancellations, citing weird vibes or negative online chatter. The relief we'd felt dissolved into a gnawing sense that we hadn't fully resolved anything. Daniel's presence might be quieter now, but something darker seemed to be lurking in the corners. Allison and I stayed late one evening to discuss next steps. We sat in the dimly lit lobby, the smell of disinfectant lingering after a routine cleaning. "I don't think Daniel is the problem anymore," Allison said, biting her lip. "I mean, he's part of it, but I think there's something else, something feeding on the emotional energy here." I nodded, recalling Lena's warning about a parasitic force. If Daniel had begun to move on, maybe that entity was now stirring more aggressively, desperate for another source of pain or fear. That night, we rummaged through the gym's storage areas, searching for any clues we might have missed. The old supply closet, the staff lounge, even the seldom-used furnace room. The furnace room was nestled behind a locked door, accessible only to maintenance. Patricia, at her wit's end, had let us borrow the key, hoping we'd find an electrical short or some rational explanation for the flickering lights. Instead, we found a cramped, musty space, thick with cobwebs and layers of dust. The furnace itself looked ancient, a hulking metal beast that groaned when we tapped it. We discovered nothing obviously unusual, no strange markings, no hidden compartments. But the feeling in that cramped room was suffocating, as though the walls watched us. We emerged empty-handed, frustration mounting. The staff had mostly left, leaving only the faint hum of security cameras and the dull whir of the HVAC. In the main gym area, the giant swing hung inert. I felt it beckoning me, a testament to all the unexplained moments we'd witnessed. Allison and I approached it warily. "If you're still here," she said softly into the darkness, "we want to help." But no movement answered, no whispered voice. just the hush of stale air. Suddenly, the overhead speakers gave a short burst of static, enough to make us jump. The lights flickered, then returned to normal. My heart thumped, though no new sound emerged from the speakers. "Maybe it's just a glitch," I mumbled, trying to steady my nerves. Allison met my eyes, and I could see doubt written all over her face. We both knew the gym's wiring had been checked and rechecked. Something else was at play. 2 days later, all illusions of calm shattered. It happened during a busy Saturday morning party. Kids laughed and screamed as they bounced on trampolines, and parents chatted on the sidelines. I was supervising the giant swing when the building shook. Just a brief tremor, but enough to send a few children stumbling. My first thought was an earthquake, but we rarely got those here. The overhead lights flashed, and the music that had been playing abruptly distorted, stretching out in a slow, eerie pitch. Several parents rushed forward, scooping their children into their arms. The entire gym was thrown into chaos. Then the swing jerked violently in my hands, nearly pulling me off my feet. A chilling gust of air surged through the space, rustling the party decorations and causing the balloons to bob wildly. I heard a child scream. A moment later, the lights went dead, plunging the gym into darkness, lit only by emergency exits. A frenzied minute ensued, people scrambling, calling for each other, the sound of small kids crying. I tried to stay calm, directing them toward the front doors. Allison appeared by my side with a flashlight. Her eyes were wide with terror. "We have to get everyone out," she shouted above the panicked din. Patricia joined us, ushering families to the exit with trembling hands. No one could figure out what had caused the sudden quake or the power surge. But I suspected we were seeing the wrath of that entity, surging to the surface now that Daniel's torment was waning. Within minutes, the gym was evacuated, parents reluctant to stay in a place so clearly unstable. Patricia locked the doors, tears brimming in her eyes. The party was ruined, and the building's reputation likely beyond repair. We reconvened in the break room, breathless and shaken. Jessie, who had also stayed behind, burst into tears, saying she couldn't handle this anymore. I couldn't blame her. The sense of dread that filled the gym was nearly palpable. Patricia looked at us with desperation. "This is it. I'm closing down for a while. I can't keep risking people's safety." Allison and I exchanged worried glances. If the gym closed, we'd lose our only means of contacting the spirit or containing whatever was fueling these events. Then again, maybe a closure was necessary, giving us time to figure out how to banish the darkness entirely. In the hush that followed, Allison took a shaky breath. "We need to confront it directly," she said, "maybe in a full-blown exorcism, or a ritual that addresses not just Daniel, but whatever else is here." Patricia nearly fainted at the word exorcism, but she didn't protest. The near disaster we'd just witnessed had left her too shaken to argue. That night, the three of us, along with Lena and her paranormal team, returned to the gym. It was eerily quiet, the neon party lights off. The entire place smelled of dust and fear. Lena brought more heavy-duty equipment this time, thermal cameras, motion detectors, and a device she claimed could detect electromagnetic fluctuations. Allison, for her part, had coordinated with her pastor to receive blessings and prayers specifically meant to counter malevolent forces. We set up in the center of the gym, near the giant swing. The plan was to combine a cleansing ritual with Lena's attempts to communicate and gather evidence. If Daniel was still around, we wanted to guide him safely away from the entity. If the entity manifested, we intended to repel it. My stomach churned at the thought of a battle, but that's what it felt like we were preparing for. Just after midnight, we began. Allison and the pastor, an older man with kind but determined eyes, recited prayers of protection. Lena's team activated their devices, scanning the area for anomalies. Patricia hovered by the entrance, arms crossed, her expression grim. I stood next to Allison, holding a flashlight and trying to keep my hands from shaking. The giant swing sat motionless, bathed in the glow of our flashlights. At first, nothing happened. Then a low rumble vibrated through the floor, reminiscent of the tremor earlier that day. The overhead speakers crackled. I felt a wave of icy coldness sweep past me, and I nearly dropped the flashlight. Lena's motion detectors started blinking like crazy, registering movement all around us, though we saw no one. Allison called out, "Daniel, if you're here, you don't have to stay. We're here to free you from this place." Her pastor echoed a prayer, commanding any dark force to release its hold. A furious screech ripped through the speakers, deafening us. I clamped my hands over my ears. The lights above flickered, revealing twisted shadows dancing along the walls. The sense of malevolence was overwhelming, as if some invisible storm raged in the rafters. In the midst of that chaos, the giant swing suddenly moved, jerking wildly like a pendulum. It struck the pastor, knocking him off balance. Allison rushed to his side, gripping his arm to steady him. Lena's cameras whirred, capturing every insane second. I caught sight of something along the ceiling, a roiling darkness, almost like a tangible cloud that coiled among the beams. My heart pounded in my ears. Was that Daniel's despair, or something older and fiercer? With a trembling voice, Allison raised her cross. "You have no power here," she cried, directing her words to whatever presence seethed overhead. "In the name of all that's holy, release Daniel. Release this place." Her voice echoed, and for a split second, I thought the darkness receded. But then the swing hurtled forward again, snapping its ropes. It crashed to the mat with a thunderous boom, and the entire gym shook. We all staggered back. Patricia screamed. The black shape in the rafters swirled, then shot across the ceiling, vanishing into a far corner. Whether we had forced it to retreat or merely provoked it further, I couldn't tell. But the sudden silence that followed was almost worse than the noise, like the building was holding its breath, waiting for a final blow. My heart pounded so hard, it nearly drowned out all thought, and I realized with a jolt that we might have just unleashed a fury that wouldn't stop until it destroyed us, or was destroyed itself. The aftermath of that harrowing confrontation left the gym in disarray. The giant swing lay collapsed on the mat, ropes frayed and metal supports twisted. Patricia, trembling, declared the place officially closed. No more parties, no more classes, until the supernatural chaos was resolved, or until she sold the property, whichever came first. The staff was sent home, some with tears in their eyes, others white-faced with terror. Lena's team packed up their gear, promising to review the footage, yet their expressions showed more concern than hope. Allison, the pastor, Patricia, and I remained behind. The pastor had sustained a bruise from the flying swing, but was otherwise unharmed. He insisted we regroup in the break room to gather our wits. The overhead lights buzzed feebly, and the stale smell of coffee clung to the air. Outside, the sky was a deep, pre-dawn gray. It felt like we were trapped in a surreal nightmare. The pastor broke the silence. "I've witnessed hauntings and spiritual oppression, but this is different," he admitted, rubbing his sore arm. "It's as though we're dealing with layered energies. Daniel's spirit, yes, but also something more malevolent, something feeding on fear." Allison nodded, shoulders slumped in exhaustion. "We can't just leave Daniel in the clutches of that thing," she said, voice trembling. Patricia's face was unreadable, torn between her desire to protect her business and the horror unfolding around us. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice quiet yet determined. "We finish this tonight," she said. "I can't keep living like this, and neither can you." She looked at the pastor. "What do you suggest?" He took a measured breath. "We do a full exorcism of the premises, with the strongest rites I know," he said. "It's risky, but if we stand firm, we might be able to free both Daniel and the gym from whatever clutches it." And so it was decided. We'd carry out one final all-or-nothing ritual at the break of dawn, no more half measures. This time, the pastor would lead us through a series of prayers and blessings designed to confront any spirits or entities directly. The plan was to systematically move through the building, cleansing each area until we reached the rafters where Daniel first appeared. Allison and I exchanged a worried glance. If the earlier confrontation was any indication, we could expect violent resistance. We reconvened on the main floor of the gym, just as pale sunlight crept through the high windows. Dust motes swirled in the beams of light, lending the space an almost sacred stillness. The pastor handed out small bottles of holy water, instructing us to sprinkle it in each section of the gym as we prayed. Patricia stood by with a flashlight, though the natural light was steadily growing. Allison clutched her cross, lips moving silently in prayer. The first few minutes were tense, but uneventful. We walked in unison, chanting the pastor's words. Patricia dabbed holy water on the mats, the walls, even the battered remains of the giant swing. I felt a slow building pressure in my ears, like we were ascending a mountain. As we neared the foam pit, a soft gust of wind rustled overhead. My heart quickened. The pastor's voice rose, commanding any dark presence to leave in peace. Without warning, the overhead speakers came alive with static. A chorus of distorted cries filled the gym, like dozens of voices overlapping. My blood ran cold. Allison faltered, nearly dropping her bottle of holy water. The pastor gritted his teeth, continuing his prayer. I forced myself to keep chanting, though fear pulsed through me. Patricia splashed holy water toward the speaker system, tears carving paths down her cheeks. The cries peaked in a high-pitched wail, then cut off abruptly, leaving us in a thick silence. My ears rang. I glanced at Allison, who nodded at me to keep moving. We pressed on, heading toward the far corner where the rafters converged. This was the spot where multiple children had pointed. The pastor's chanting grew louder, echoing off the metal beams. A cold draft hit us, carrying a foul stench that made my stomach churn. It smelled like decay and burnt plastic, the same odor staff had reported earlier. Suddenly, the metal rafters groaned as if bearing a massive weight. I shone my flashlight upward. The swirling darkness reappeared, coalescing into a vaguely humanoid shape. My heart pounded in my throat. Allison gasped, and Patricia let out a stifled scream. The shape contorted, pulsing with an oily blackness that defied all logic. The pastor aimed his cross toward it. "In the name of the Holy One, release this place!" he thundered. A deafening roar erupted from above, vibrating through the steel. The shape extended a tendril of shadow, striking the pastor's cross. Sparks flew, and the cross went spinning out of his hand. For a moment, chaos reigned. Allison screamed, Patricia stumbled, and I felt a surge of cold slam into my chest, knocking me backward. I collided with a stack of mats, fighting for air. My vision blurred. Through the haze, I saw Allison scramble for the pastor's cross. She scooped it up, tears streaming down her face. Holding it aloft, she shouted, "Daniel, if you can hear me, fight back. Don't let it control you." Her words reverberated in the gym, cutting through the roaring wind that now whipped at our clothes. The shape lurched as though in pain. I thought I heard a faint sob beneath the cacophony, a child's cry. Summoning my strength, I pushed myself to my feet. "Daniel," I yelled, my voice cracking. "Your father came for you. He loves you. You don't have to stay here." The darkness flickered, and I sensed a tremor running through it. The pastor recovered, grabbing another cross from his pocket. He joined Allison in the invocation, both of them demanding the darkness relinquish its hold. Patricia, face pale with terror, cast holy water upward in shaky arcs. A final roar tore through the air so loud it felt like my skull might crack. Then, in a burst of light, a sudden, blinding flash from nowhere, the black shape dispersed into smoky wisps, vanishing among the rafters. For a long moment, no one moved. We stood there, hearts hammering, ears ringing in the echo of that explosive confrontation. The overhead beams creaked, but only in the normal, settling way old metal does. The floor stopped shaking. The suffocating heaviness lifted, replaced by an overwhelming sense of stillness. Allison crumpled to her knees, sobbing, the cross still clenched in her hand. The pastor knelt beside her, murmuring reassurances. Patricia leaned against the wall, breathing in ragged gasps, tears staining her cheeks. I stood in the center of the gym, legs trembling. The space felt different, lighter, as if someone had thrown open a window to let fresh air in. Outside, the morning sun shone brighter, painting the chipped walls in soft gold. Slowly, we realized the haunting presence was gone. The malevolent force that had latched onto Daniel's sorrow had been expelled. And Daniel, somehow, through our pleas, had finally found a path free from his torment. A quiet hush fell over the gym, not ominous this time, but peaceful. I felt tears burning at the corners of my eyes, a mix of relief and heartbreak for the lost boy who could finally move on. The rest of the morning was a blur. Patricia decided to keep the gym closed for a thorough inspection. She talked about repairs and possibly a rebranding, unsure if she'd ever reopen Jump and Joy under its old name. The pastor offered to bless the building further, ensuring no lingering negative energies remained. Allison and I helped, sprinkling holy water in every corner, reciting soft prayers. In the days that followed, word spread discreetly among employees and a few curious parents that the issue was resolved. We never publicly admitted to an exorcism or a supernatural encounter. Patricia quietly replaced damaged equipment, including the giant swing, though she no longer seemed comfortable advertising it as a main attraction. As for me and Allison, we continued working there for a time, each day noting how the place felt less like a haunted domain and more like a simple kids' gym again. Sometimes, late at night after closing, I'd stand beneath the rafters and stare up, half expecting to sense Daniel's presence. But there was only silence and the gentle hum of the newly upgraded lights. I'd let out a breath, caught between relief and a wistful ache. Part of me hoped Daniel was at peace, maybe reunited with the memory of his father's love. Another part of me wondered if he might occasionally return, just to watch over the swing he'd longed to ride. But no more voices manifested through the speakers, no more shadows crawled across the beams. The nightmares that had plagued my sleep gradually faded. Allison seemed more at ease too, though she sometimes prayed for Daniel, imagining him finally free from the trauma that had bound him. And though Jump and Joy remained a place of laughter and celebration for children, I knew it had forever changed for those of us who witnessed the darkness within its walls. Even now, whenever I pass by that old warehouse building, I can't help but glance up at the ceiling windows. I remember the fear, the heartbreak, and the ultimate release that occurred there. The memory of a lonely boy in the rafters still tugs at my mind. Yet, in the end, the shadows receded, and a fragile peace took their place. It's a reminder that even in the most unexpected corners, sorrow and love can collide. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to face it, we can bring light where darkness once reigned.